So this presentation, which is about data and the humanities, is drawn from a longer piece that deals with the question in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to give you a sense of how I've been thinking about this topic. And I started thinking about it in terms of a fairly simple question, which is, why don't humanists refer to their sources as data? And I think we've all seen examples of humanists resisting that term to describe their research materials. Maybe you remember this 2012 essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books, where Stephen Marsh asserts that literature is not data. And there's something about that kind of assertion that seems straightforward, but the more you consider it, the more it's a little bit of a mind bender. Because for one thing, if you stick to prevailing definitions of data, it's hard to see what exactly disqualifies humanities sources from being named by this term. The Oxford English Dictionary, for example, offers two definitions. A, related items of chiefly numerical information considered collectively, typically obtained by scientific work and used for reference analysis or calculation. And B, computing, quantities, characters, or symbols on which operations are performed by a computer, considered collectively. Also in non-technical contexts, information in digital form. To me, both of these definitions are so vague that they're scarcely useful. It seems as though, according to the OED, data is something a computer can act upon, and it may be scientific, but maybe not, or maybe it's just information in digital form. So while this kind of definition does capture common uses of the term, I don't think it can fully account for the difference between humanities sources and data. So I thought maybe I could approach this question from the other end, starting with investigating which methods are specific to the humanities. And it would seem to make sense then to look at definitions of the humanities, but here again we find ourselves in a bit of a morass, because if you go looking for definitions of the humanities, you'll find that they're actually pretty thin on the ground. There are many odes to the humanities, defenses of the humanities, arguments in favor of the humanities, but very few actual definitions of them. The definition that the National Endowment for the Humanities uses reads, "The term humanities includes but is not limited to the study and interpretation of the following: language, both modern and classical, linguistics, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history, criticism, and theory of the arts, those aspects of social sciences which have humanistic content and employ humanistic methods." So it's sort of a grab bag of disciplines that at times seems to circle back on itself and disclaim any responsibility for defining the thing it's purporting to define. Humanities is art, literature, the humanistic social sciences, the humanities. So the humanities deals with human cultural production. On that we can agree, but does it necessarily include a difference in method as well as in the subject of its scrutiny? That is to say, is the humanities distinct just because it looks at human cultural production, or because it looks at it in a special way? It's not clear from the NEH's definition, although I think many of us would agree that there is something distinctive about the humanities, even if it's just devaluation in the current labor market. But why does it matter? Like porn, we know the humanities when we see it. So must we really contort ourselves to find a definition? Well, I think it does matter, and I'll use a particular example to explain why. For many years, I think people from other disciplines have more or less left humanities sources to the humanists. Literature, art, movies, etc., let the humanities people deal with them. And that's why it was such a shock to so many people when this article, Quantitative Analysis of Culture, using millions of digitized books, came out in 2011, not incidentally in the journal Science. The authors are scientists, linguists, and mathematicians, and they turn the statistical and computational tools of their disciplines on the products of human culture. Specifically, 5 million books from Google's enormous corpus of English language works produced between 1800 and 2000. They called what they were doing culturomics, a play on the word genomics, and argued for the relevance of this new field to history, gender studies, the history of religion and linguistics, among many other fields. And here's an example of the kinds of assertions that were being made in this article and in their subsequent book. In figure C here, you can see that they've suggested that feminism, made early inroads in France, but the United States proved to be a more fertile environment in the long run. And they make this assertion based on the relative frequency of those keywords in the Google corpus. In figure 2, similarly, in the battle of the sexes, the women are gaining ground on the men. And again, this assertion is based on keyword frequency. So people loved this, or at least the media did, but humans reacted with almost visceral distaste. This was certainly something, but the graphs and charts and statistical takeaways bore more resemblance to Trivial Pursuit answers than anything that I could recognize as humanistic scholarship. But I think that this is happening right now because we find ourselves at a moment where the study of human cultural production, stuff like novels and poetry, art and literature, used to be the sole province of humanists because no one else really cared. But with mass digitization of the cultural record, suddenly other people from other disciplines do care, and they're excited to turn the methods of their disciplines on stuff that used to belong only to humanists. So definitions of humanities scholarship that used to define the field in terms of the stuff it studied are clearly no longer fully sufficient. But at the same time, we haven't really articulated why the way we study this stuff matters as much as the stuff we study. And that's what makes possible a situation like culturomics, where scientists can amble onto the stage using statistical techniques on the human record and claim to have solved history. So now I think is the time for humanists to articulate why some of these techniques don't fully do justice to the things we value. Otherwise, for all a layperson can tell, why are we not just incompetent scientists? So in the following, I want to present an abridged version of several characteristics that I think are problematic for humanists when faced with data. So that is, what do we imply when we propose to treat our research materials as data? Well, first, when you treat a source as data, the boundaries of each record must be demarcated in some way. Information cannot exist in an undifferentiated mass if we're going to perform computational operations on it, even if you perform those operations by hand. And yet, humanists tend not to see events, objects, or even people as cleanly disconnected from one another. For example, one of the culturomics diagrams gave us information about the dates on which the telephone, radio, and other media were invented. Well, the very word invention tends to make a historian squirm because it suggests that objects are cut cleanly from whole cloth. They weren't here and then they were here. But we see individual technologies as emerging from constellations of forces, not as suddenly appearing like thunderbolts. And in fact, we tend not to think of various pieces of technology as separate in and of themselves. The notion of remediation, for example, suggests that previous technologies are always built in to the technologies that precede them. In the way, for example, that cinema swallowed many of the attributes of vaudeville and television swallowed many of the attributes of cinema, and on and on. So for us, they're not really separate, they're all connected. The term ontology can mean many different things, as you probably know. In philosophy, it often refers to the basic essence of something, while in computer science and information science, ontology refers to the way you've organized entities in order to create a data model. But I actually kind of like this confusing aspect of the word because it seems to me that it gets at an important aspect of the term, that the way we divide the world into categories does express something fundamental about the way we see the world. And one person's ontology often won't make sense for another person. Now, databases, on the other hand, are designed to stabilize relationships, even if just for a moment, because otherwise we can't retrieve information from them. But when humanists think about the way things are connected to each other, they're trained to be really attentive to the way these connections change depending on who's doing the looking. And one example of the way this is played out in the real world is the case of indigenous communities trying to make their cultural materials retrievable in libraries and archives. Most cultural institutions actually classify indigenous artifacts under the single heading of antiquities, which makes perfect sense if you're a colonial administrator. But of course, if you're a member of an indigenous community, your stuff is very much not antique. So in response, we've seen a good number of alternate classification schemas arising from indigenous communities, and the Brian Deere classification system is probably the best known of these. So ontology is sort of the ground you walk on or the air you breathe. It's the basic assumptions that you make about how you should understand the world. Now, scientists have many disputes about many things, but they also tend to have a shared understanding of the terms of their debate. Humanists love to change the terms of the debate. You could say it's our specialty. And not just because we're sneaky, but because we think it's important, if you're representing human culture, to understand that not every human experiences the world in the same way. So standardized models of the world become very troublesome in this context. If you're a historian or cultural scholar, you bring to your work the knowledge that history contains a plenitude that is impossible to replicate. We cannot know everything that happened in the past because the historical record is so partial and incomplete. We have ways of dealing with that necessary incompleteness in humanities scholarship. We can talk about the gaps in the archive, the contingencies of the historical record, the voices that tended not to be recorded. But data has a way of reifying itself because we don't have a programmatic or visual vocabulary for talking about what's not in a data set. And so, to a historian, a data set sometimes seems to boast of a definitiveness it should not claim. Even if the data set is explicitly a sample, it purports to be representative, or it wouldn't be valid. So a data set is necessarily bounded. Otherwise, like Borges's map, a data set would sprawl beyond even our advanced ability to manage it. But of course, historical phenomena aren't bounded in that way. So all of these operations that I've just described are performed under the sign of categorization, which is what I want to argue is at the heart of the humanistic refusal to embrace data. The world as it exists is a cacophony of phenomena, none of which is inherently categorized in any particular way. So in order to turn any of this mess into computable data, we need to identify those parts of any object or phenomenon that are meaningful and then give labels to those attributes. For example, I could be classified as a woman, a scholar, a digital humanist, a mother, a brown-haired person, or any number of other things depending on what you're interested in. The label we pick depends on the kind of thing we're interested in counting. And we have to standardize those labels in order for them to be at all meaningful. I may like to call myself a woman with an A, and you may like woman with a Y. But in order to have any kind of meaningful category to represent the idea of womanhood, we need to standardize the label we're using. Now, that's not to say you can't have synonyms in your database, but of course, those two terms lumped together are not the same thing as each term individually. And yet, if we're going to work with data in any meaningful way, we have to do stuff like that, like creating authorities for gender and race, because we need to be able to aggregate and disaggregate data in order to make it anything other than a whole bunch of individual cells in a table. Categorization is famously and fascinatingly problematic, which I know librarians know better than anyone. But categorization in and of itself isn't, I don't think, the problem for humanists. We classify all the time. Anyone who thinks about anything at scale has to do that. Human beings in general probably do that. We talk about World War II as a thing, for example, or the antebellum era, or Black people and white people. You could even argue that humanists spend most of our time classifying, like this is what race is, or this is what reading is, or this is what a film is. But the problem, I think, comes when an argument depends on the application of ahistorical categories across disparate swaths of time and space, or disparate communities of people, which is to say when an argument depends on what we're calling data at any kind of scale. And this is when humanists get really itchy and uncomfortable. Because really good humanities scholarship, like the stuff that you really remember that kind of breaks your brain, doesn't take existing categories as its raw material. The whole point of it is to break existing categories by making new and unexpected connections, new ontologies. And the most powerful humanities scholarship is that which breaks the categories that seem absolutely the most natural to us. So natural that it wouldn't even occur to us to question them. So natural that they wouldn't even appear to be categories. Things like man and woman, black and white, human, non-human. We use evidence, definitely, but to build new ontological frameworks, not for the most part to fill in gaps on a timeline. And I think that's why the culturomics stuff seems strange to us, and why a lot of humanists have resisted the label of data, because it assumes that these categories, which are the very things we're trying to question, have some kind of salience across time and space. It's a display of technical virtuosity that's actually completely irrelevant to what we're concerned about. Now, all of this probably makes it sound as though I hate data, but of course that's not actually the case. I find it fascinating and I love to work with it. It's just that I think that those of us who are interested in using data for humanistic work need to think of different methods for working with it and very possibly new visual rhetorics. So I'm really interested going forward in finding ways to think about and represent data that are more congenial to the knowledge systems that produced them. That means, I think, devising different, more fluid and subtle data classification systems, but also forms of visualization that can express multiple perspectives, changing timescales, and multivocality. I think that we might actually have to invent new visual rhetorics to represent these registers, since our current repertoire is too limited and concrete. My sense, speaking to people who specialize in database design, is that they actually understand these challenges to representing information and feel them as keenly as we do. So the question is, what do we do? Do we build ever more detailed data models, like a Borgesian map? Or do we develop new conventions to express some of this complexity without trying to recreate it? So I have some ideas about the answer to that question, but I think because my time is up, I want to leave it here today. Thank you so much for letting me present remotely, and I hope you have a great time at the symposium.